Life is set to change across regional WA and WA more broadly from midnight tonight when these interstate restrictions come into place. Essentially, the boundaries align with the Regional Development Commission areas, of which there are 9, one of which, the Peel region, will be included in the Perth catchment. Basically, it means that non-essential travel is banned, and looking ahead, it's based on this concern about regional communities' capacity to respond. So from tonight, there'll be spot checks and mobile patrols, and that was laid out by the Premier, Mark McGowan, today. This is a little bit of what he had to say.
That random checkpoints and mobile patrols will be in place to monitor travel across boundaries and ensure that people are doing the right thing. I know it's not perfect, and I know there'll be some frustration, but if frustration means that people get the message, well, then that's a good thing.
Jessica, what's considered essential travel, and what will the penalty be for breaching the rules?
Yeah, so essential travel is for things like education, medicine, if you need to travel to Perth or another region to see a doctor, if you live across a boundary, or if you have to travel for schooling, or to also if you need to get to Perth to fulfil a role as a carer. It's also, there are exemptions in place for the construction and freight industries, which will be exempt as well. Now, in terms of the penalties, they're quite hefty. The Premier isn't taking any chances, and this is a non-negotiable for him. He's spelling out a $50,000 penalty for those found to have breached those non-essential travel restrictions across borders.
So how has the decision been received by regional communities?
Well, I'm in the state's southwest this afternoon. This is the boundary of Perth and the southwest. Usually at this time of year, it would be communities and businesses would be welcoming people coming down here for Easter. It's a very busy time of the year, but this year it's a very different message. They're really welcoming the Premier's approach. There's a real clear message around making sure that people are knowing that they're not welcome in the southwest, in places like the southwest. And it's quite unprecedented because a lot of the businesses and communities rely on the funding, on the money coming in at this time of year to be able to survive the year during the off-season over the winter. So it's a very interesting state of play here in the southwest, and quite unprecedented rather, when we look at the scope of the logistics of trying to implement something like this across such a giant state.
Yeah, difficult times ahead. Jessica Hayes reporting there from WA Southwest. The federal government has announced more than $200 billion in measures to deal with the fallout of the coronavirus, including $130 billion in wage subsidies. For more on whether this latest stimulus package will be enough to bolster the economy, I'm joined from Canberra by Bruce Chapman, who's a professor at the College of Business and Economics at the Australian National University. Bruce Chapman, thank you so much for your time tonight. What's your reaction to the wage subsidy scheme that was announced by the government yesterday?
I think the concept is just right. A huge amount of financial resources needs to be delivered quickly, and the sharing between firms and their workers, I think, is a good design feature. What we won't know is how effective this will be and whether it is sufficient. The important point is that to have it out quick and to have it out big, and that's what the government's doing.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about whether it will be enough, because it's $1,500 per employee per fortnight. Unions yesterday welcomed the stimulus package but wanted it to be more generous. Are you satisfied with the level that it's at?
It's hard to be satisfied when you don't know what this means. This world is so completely uncertain. We've got to wait and see. It might be sufficient so that not much more is required on top of the other measures, or it might not be sufficient. It depends very much on the speed of the spread of the virus. If that starts to slow down, then government can relax regulations and business activity can go more towards the normal. But if that's not the case, this could go on. And I think people's making judgments about the size are premature. We don't have the data. We need to know what's going to happen in the next 2 months.
I know you're an economist, but I did want to ask you about the politics of this. Last week, the federal government was saying it wasn't looking to introduce a wage subsidy scheme. It's obviously come around now to this particular scheme, but didn't implement what the UK has done, which is an 80% wage subsidy scheme. So why do you think the government came to this decision?
I have no idea. I haven't been talking directly with the government. To talk to me about politics is not a great idea because I'm an economist and I'm fairly specialised, actually. So I'll leave that to the people who understand it.
Well, your specialty is income contingent loans. You were one of the architects of the HEX system. How do you think that could work in this current pandemic economic crisis?
Let me explain how HEX works for people who aren't on top of it or who have forgotten. What the system means is that all Australian undergraduates can enrol in university without paying anything. Instead, they agree to pay their tuition in the future, but when and only if they are earning a certain amount of money. And it's about $45,000 a year, and then at a low rate, 1%. Now, this is a loan, but it's a very unusual kind of loan. It's a loan with insurance. It means that if you don't have the money in the future in particular points in time, maybe there's unemployment like now, for example, or maybe you're looking after a newborn baby or aged parents, there is no requirement to repay and there's no prospect of default. This is unlike all the other types of student loan systems around the world. And this is a really important thing because it means that the normal hazards associated with debt are not there. There's no need for anxiety about repayment hardship, and there's no such concept as default. So my colleagues and I, Warwick McGibbon, Linda Bottrell and Glenn Withers, wanted to turn this into part of the public policy debate now, because this is the kind of way of diminishing the cost, the longer-term cost to the budget, in businesses and individuals with debt, for contingent debt arrangement. Linda Bottrell and I have modelled this for small business in the form of farm assistance for drought, and we're fairly confident that it can be made to work, but not using income. You'd use revenue, and that's all reported through the Australian the business activity statement. HEX has been there for 30 years. It's extremely efficient. So these are instruments that can be used, we're fairly confident, without too many issues and problems of administration, and they have great potential. But I would say we should wait and see. There's going to be very large implications of what the government has just announced. And if that works, fine, that's kind of where we need to be. But if it doesn't work enough or quickly enough or it's not more targeted enough in retrospect, other instruments are required. And the contingent debt would be one of those. Yeah,
so tell us what kind of system you're proposing, and would it be for all businesses and all individuals?
I think you would target it on the people who are most adversely affected by the crisis, which is what the government's doing, for example, with New Start or with the wage subsidy scheme. So this could be an add-on. You could offer a few $1,000s down the track to individuals in that situation as a loan, not all of it to be paid back, maybe only half, and to be paid through the existing HEX arrangements. So they're the citizens that could be assisted. For small business, you would cap the debt at, say, depending on how their revenue experience in the past, maybe $25,000 for small ones and up to much larger figures for medium-sized business. But again, only repaid in the future when the revenues recover. That's the beauty of these systems. For large business, the government's not in the game and does not have the commercial expertise to operate very large loans. That's what banks do, among other things. And if the banks are offering assistance for large business, the government could also top this up with a revenue contingent loan, which would facilitate the repayment of the bank loan for large businesses when they get back on track and are able to repay. And that's a critical point about these debts. If you are not in a position to pay, you don't. And if you are, you pay a little bit more, not necessarily all of it. And it has a great potential of taking some of the adverse consequences away from future budgets.
There are some critics of the HECS system because you said there's no repayment hardship. Some young people who say that their ability to repay their HECS debt is stopping them from doing other things like buying property and entering the property market. There is also a huge amount owing to government, isn't there, from the HECS scheme? So if this were to be implemented more widely, would you end up with the same problem, just huge debts that don't get repaid?
Well, the critical point is whether or not they're repaid. The idea that there's a large stock of debt is not very interesting if getting repaid. So often people kind of inaccurately point to the alleged problem of a $30 billion unpaid HECS debt. But we know the government accounting illustrates that about 85% or more of this will be repaid. So what is the problem? I don't think it's a problem. The stock of debt is really not interesting. It's the repayments that matter. For the people who don't like the HECS arrangements, I guess the question is, could it be designed more generously? It's already got a very high starting threshold compared to other contingent debts. And the other point to make is, what are the alternatives with things like HECS? You could make it free, so-called free, which just means university education is paid for by all taxpayers and not specifically a little bit more by those who are the beneficiaries. That's a very regressive arrangements. Or you could do what is done in other countries, bank loans. And those have the unfortunate characteristic for people, students in the future and graduates in debt, that they do not forgive if there's no capacity to pay. So as far as the choices are concerned, I think having a capacity to pay debt for HECS has shown to work just fine and is not associated with default problems. The system is now 3 times bigger than when this all began, and a lot of that's got to do with the fact that governments were prepared to outlay a lot more to expand university enrolments.
Okay, Bruce Chapman from the College of Business and Economics at the Australian National University. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
My pleasure.